the Ukrainians are basically screwed. And it's about time people recognized that fact and came to the understanding that the best thing that could be done for the Ukrainians is to cut a deal now.
John Mearsheimer was recently on Piers Morgan's podcast talking a little bit about the current situation in the war in Ukraine with Russian and Ukrainian forces still dug in. He gets into a little bit of how dire the situation is for Ukraine and what the result and how effective the recent drone strike was on Russia's nuclear bombers. So let's watch, let's react. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
We've seen a lot of developments since you and I last spoke about 4 months ago, but significantly in the last week. First, the incredibly audacious attack by Ukraine using the drones that they sent on trucks into the heart of Russia, which was obviously extraordinarily successful, but also the inevitable attacks back now from Russia, launching 315 drones in one of its largest strikes on Kyiv, the capital, causing a lot of damage, injuring a lot of people and so on. This is entirely predictable, I would say. But where does this leave us in where this war now is, do you think?
I think these attacks had zero effect on the outcome of the war. These were pinpricks at the most. The idea that these attacks have shifted the balance of power in any meaningful way is not a serious argument. My guess is that they probably destroyed or crippled somewhere on the order of 4 or 5 aircraft. But how's that going to affect this war? It's just not going to have any effect. What really matters here, and what people are not talking about enough, is the fact that the Ukrainians struck at Russian strategic nuclear forces. They hit one leg of the nuclear triad. Now, they only destroyed a handful of bombers, but the mere fact that they went after Russian strategic nuclear forces is downright scary, and lots of people have made that point.
Yeah, I have to agree with him here. This doesn't really change the situation on the ground where Russia still controls about 85 to 90% of the Donbass. And yeah, they took out a few bombers. It was an audacious plan. Apparently, it took 18 months to plan this, and somehow, you know, Trump wasn't aware of it. The U.S. administration wasn't aware of it, which I don't really believe. And maybe there's a possibility his administration wasn't, but some area of the deep state and the CIA certainly was. We know that the CIA feeds Ukraine its intelligence. That was actually shut down for a few days when Trump had the good sense to withdraw it. And then he restored it about 6 or 7 days later after that famous episode with Zelensky in the White House. So you have to agree with Mearsheimer here. It looks like Ukraine's drones, and ostensibly it was Ukraine. Who knows if it really was their drones or someone else in NATO. But they took out maybe 4, and some of the other ones that were hit are apparently able to be repaired. So yeah, he's right. This doesn't change the situation on the ground right now. This was for optics. This was to try to sell and fundraise to keep this war going from Zelensky's standpoint.
Very clearly in the higher levels of the administration. And I believe, by the way, Piers, this is why President Trump called President Putin on June 4th. You remember the attacks took place on June 1st. I think that Trump was scared that the Russians would do something that would cause a lot of trouble simply because the Ukrainians, who we were surely helping, hit Russian strategic nuclear forces, hit one leg of their nuclear triad. But in terms of the actual war and what's happening here, this is a meaningless attack.
Yeah, and actually, I think I would even go further than Mearsheimer is saying here. This actually gives Putin, in his eyes, the political capital and wherewithal and justification necessary for potential new offensives into Ukraine, perhaps pushing to the southwest all the way to Odessa, taking more territory when it's clear that some people thought that there was a guise or an auspice of the possibility of peace, that the U.S. had engaged directly with Putin, whereas Biden never did that. Taking that step made people think that this war might exactly be winding down. But this represents the most serious escalation optically. It doesn't change the situation on the battlefield, but the way that this is playing out, this is a propaganda ploy from Zelensky's part, again, to achieve more funding at a time where, you know, the money keeps rolling in to Kyiv from the United States Treasury. Taxpayers are paying for it under an administration that said they would end the war. So let's keep watching.
Well, you say meaningless. I mean, there's been reports that it could have been as many as 24 aircraft hit, each valued at $100 million. That's not meaningless.
Well, the initial reports had like 40 planes, and then it got scaled back to like 17 in some reports, and then you saw 7 and 4. So depending on who you believe, it is a handful to some regard. But again, it doesn't change the situation on the ground. So Pierce is pointing this out, and it's not really germane to the situation we're panning out there. Now, I'll eat crow. Bring it up to me in a future comment if Ukraine takes back significant portions of the Donbass, because they haven't really taken over anything to speak of in the Donbass since the summer of 2024. That was repelled by early 2025.
And I would secondly say the more significant aspect of it was humiliating for Putin, who would never have seen this coming, must have been deeply shocked at the scale of the raid and how successful it was. So notwithstanding the fact you're probably right, it doesn't really change the bigger picture of the war, but it certainly was a humiliating blow to Putin. I mean, that surely we can agree on.
I'm sure it was humiliating, but humiliation means virtually nothing in how this war turns out. You can humiliate Putin every day of the week, and it's not going to have any effect on the battlefield. And what happens on the battlefield is what matters here.
Yeah, I have to agree. I mean, there's been times when Ukraine's tried to assassinate Putin in Moscow. We know that that's happened, I believe, in the summer of 2023, and maybe other times. I mean, is that a humiliation? Same with taking out a few bombers. In the grand scheme of things, it really is not that relevant.
What is happening on the battlefield in your estimation? People say Ukraine, through this drone attack, is showing that it has the resolve and indeed the technical expertise to potentially repel Russia for a lot longer than people thought. Others think that the scale of Russia's attacks since that drone attack suggest they're going to move very aggressively now through the summer to try and exploit the better weather conditions and to really get a grip of this war. What's your assessment?
Well, I think if you look at what's happening on the battlefield, the Russians are gaining more and more territory every day, and they're destroying more and more Ukrainian forces. And if you look at the underlying balance of power, it's clear, even from Western sources, that the Ukrainians are in really deep trouble. The Royal United Services Institute in London put out a study in February of this year. And if you look at the numbers carefully, it's quite clear that the Ukrainians are outnumbered at least 3-1, maybe 3.5-1 on the front lines. If you look at the amount of artillery on both sides, you look at the number of drones on both sides, and you take into account the fact that the Russians have these smart bombs that are doing massive amounts of destruction to frontline forces on the Ukrainian side, it's hard to imagine how the Russians don't win this war. It may take them longer than some people think is the case, but nevertheless, the Russians are going to prevail in the end. And you want to remember, Piers, at the same time, the Trump administration is basically withdrawing its support for Ukraine. So the long-term future for Ukraine is very bleak.
Mostly agree with Mearsheimer there. The thing that he said at the end actually isn't true. You know, Trump did pull support for Zelensky for a matter of about a week, but it got restored after that. And since then, it has not been shut down. I believe that was back in March, the few days that it was taken away. But he's not right that, you know, support is being pulled away. Also, I would add to what he said is that, you know, one of the things that we've seen is that Ukraine has constantly tried to alter their conscription laws to expand them, make them more expansive, make it easier to conscript soldiers for this war. And there's no evidence Russia is doing that. Now, that tells me something. That tells me that Ukraine is more desperate than Russia, and Russia hasn't, you know, committed the forces that would be necessary to take over all of Ukraine. So a lot of people have always said that's the goal, and then Poland's next, and all this nonsense about Putin trying to revive the USSR. That is garbage. He wanted to enforce the Minsk Accords, what Ukraine wasn't doing. And he got the Donbass out of it. That wasn't ideal from the Ukrainian perspective, but the Donbass provinces did not want to be part of Ukraine in the first place. So Let's continue.
What does victory look like to Russia? What are they actually trying to achieve here? Some think they're making a play now to take over the whole of Ukraine. Others think they may even expand and attack Moldova, for example. Others think that actually they've always just wanted this southeast corridor. They believe that is what they need to protect themselves from, as they see it, the NATO encroachment in recent years. What is your view of what the actual end game looks like for Russia?
Well, I don't think they're going to take over all of Ukraine. First of all, they need hundreds of thousands more forces to do that. Because you want to understand that once they began to move into Western Ukraine, assuming they were able to conquer that, they'd need huge numbers of troops to deal with the insurrection that surely would ensue. I think they will stay out of the western half of Ukraine because it would be a hornet's nest. And again, they don't have the forces to do that. I think they now control about 20% of Ukraine, 4 oblasts plus Crimea. And I think the great danger is that if we don't settle the war now, they'll end up taking 4, 5, maybe even 6 more oblasts. And Ukraine will end up losing close to 40% of its territory instead of 20%. So I think, and I've argued this for a long time, that it's in Ukraine's interest to settle this one immediately, accept the fact that they've lost about 20% of their territory, but go to great lengths to prevent losing more territory.
Yeah, I think that's generally right. I don't think that Putin's desire is to have all of Ukraine. Like Mearsheimer said, it would require so many more forces, though I do fear that Putin will be able to sell a new offensive to the southwest, again, possibly all the way to Odessa, but I think he's right there.
Right, but how do they do that? Because they lost Crimea, and then we had all the reassurances from Russia that they wouldn't want any more of Ukraine, and then there we were, 2022, they attack mainland Ukraine, and they've now seized 20% of it, as you say. Why would Ukraine trust Russia as far as it could throw it in terms of doing any kind of settlement, which allowed Russia potentially to just come back and attack again down the road, as it did after Crimea?
Well, the thing is that the Russians have made it clear that they would like to settle this war. And they have a set of terms that they're demanding that the Ukrainians and the West agree to. I think it's quite clear that if the Ukrainians and the West agree to those terms, and I could lay them out for you, that the Russians would end the war and settle with 20%, because the terms that the Russians want would leave them in a secure position and they would have no incentive to take more territory. The problem, though, is there's no way the Ukrainians or the West will accept Russia's terms. This is why you can't get any kind of meaningful peace agreement, and it's also why the Russians won't agree to a ceasefire. So this war is going to be settled on the battlefield, and the end result is, I think, will happen is that Ukraine will end up losing more territory. But it's in large part, just to reiterate what I'm saying, because the political terms that the Russians are demanding are unacceptable to the Ukrainians.
Yeah, I mostly agree with that. Before this war, Putin sent a draft treaty to NATO saying, just put it in writing that Ukraine won't be part of NATO and I won't invade. I actually don't think originally Putin wanted the Donbass, but what happened there was the Minsk Accords were not implemented fully. Ukraine decided not to implement them, which would have required giving those provinces special autonomy, the more Russian-leaning cultural oblasts. So Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, which are the 4 provinces that Russia now occupies. If anything, Putin engaged in a measured approach. He did invade, for sure, but he felt like he was being pushed into a corner by NATO, who was setting up this Aegis missile system along his borders. Whereas also, Trump decided to throw about $400 million there after being warned by Democrats, if you withhold this funding to Ukraine, we're going to impeach you. He gave them that arms and included the javelins, which sometimes he even boasts about giving them the anti-tank javelins, and they still impeached him anyway. So that's where we're at. I fear indeed that a new offensive may come, but Russia clearly hasn't dedicated the forces to this war to take Kyiv and Ukraine proper, to be sure. In
terms of Donald Trump's position on this, he famously said, of course, he would resolve all this in one day. That day came and went very quickly with no resolution. He now has said that Putin's gone absolutely crazy and is playing with fire. I think Putin has to be careful with Trump. Trump can be an unpredictable player in these situations. If he feels like Putin is basically trying to embarrass Trump by ignoring everything that he says, I could see Trump doing something that may surprise people.
I think, Piers, up until June 1st, there was a lot of support for what you are saying. I think after the attacks on June 1st, and here we're emphasizing the Ukrainian attacks on Russia's strategic nuclear forces, Trump came to understand that we're playing with fire here, that striking at Russian nuclear forces was very dangerous and very foolish. And Trump had, on June 4th, this is 3 days after the June 1st attacks, he had an hour and 15-minute conversation with Putin. That's a relatively short conversation when you take into account translations. And at the end, when Trump posted on Truth Social, he said that the two of them had a good conversation and that he understood that the Russians were going to retaliate against Ukraine in a really serious way. Now, Trump usually says when he has a conversation with anybody, certainly with somebody like Trump, with somebody like Putin, that it's a wonderful conversation. He's very positive. Trump's report of the conversation was not very positive, and he said that he understood the Russians were going to attack Ukraine in a serious way as a result of what happened on June 1st. And Trump did not say that was unacceptable. I think, based on what we've seen since June 1st, is that Trump has changed his tune. He understands the Ukrainians are going to lose, and he understands supporting the Ukrainians when they pursue policies like they did on June 1st when they attacked those strategic bombers is not good for the United States. So I think that Donald Trump is slowly but steadily moving away from the Ukrainians and the Europeans, and he's getting closer to Putin.
Interesting. This is an area where I probably very much disagree with Mearsheimer. He reads this interesting, and there's some merit to how Trump responded to this phone conversation, but we haven't seen any evidence in terms of the money flow that the spigot's been turned off. If anything, we've seen increased intervention from the U.S. since, obviously, the time in which Trump cut it off. He returned it again under the auspices of, hey, Ukraine's agreeing to the ceasefire, which was never going to work, and is willing to cut us a mineral deal and give us access to minerals that lie in the Russian-occupied territories anyways. That was just absurd. But if anything, I think that the support has remained status quo and actually maybe inched toward more intervention. So it's rare that I disagree with Mearsheimer on Ukraine, but I think I probably do here unless I see more evidence to believe that Trump's going to withdraw funding, which really is the America First solution that would force a peace.
The one thing I would say back at that, which may contradict what you just said, is that very unusually, Trump did not condemn what Ukraine did on June the 1st. He actually very, very noticeably did not, which suggests that he didn't really have that big a problem with what Ukraine did.
Well, I don't think he wanted to humiliate Ukraine, but I think more important.
Well, it's never stopped him before.
Yeah, I think this is maybe the only time ever where I've agreed with Piers Morgan over Mearsheimer on foreign policy, just this avenue of it. But he's right. Trump didn't exactly say this is derailing the peace process that we want to happen with Russia, and he won. They're bankrolling it. The military-industrial complex profits off this the longer it goes. We saw the same thing in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and Somalia and Yemen, of course. We're seeing that now.
I mean, look, this is a guy who's humiliated the president of Ukraine in the Oval Office. I don't think he's worried about humiliating him. It just seemed to me that it was very noticeable that the president of the United States did not condemn that attack right into the heartland of Russia on, as you say, very sensitive military aircraft.
No, I think what's more important, Piers, is that he said that the United States had nothing to do with it. He went to great lengths to distance the United States from that attack because he understands full well. Keith Kellogg understands full well. His former national security advisor, Mike Flynn, understands full well that this was a remarkably foolish move on the part of the Ukrainians. And it was not in the American national interest for an ally of ours like Ukraine to attack strategic nuclear forces belonging to Russia. So I think what you see here is Trump distancing himself from the Ukrainians, not supporting them in any way.
All right, but let me throw.
But who could trust Trump, honestly? Do you think Putin trusts Trump on that? Especially after this recent scam that Trump led Iran to believe that they are negotiating to curtail Iran's nuclear program such that it wouldn't be struck. Well, Israel struck it anyway, and we've known, due to reports, that Trump's known that for at least a week, and that attack was apparently 8 months in the making. Axios reported that, and we heard inklings of it in the corporate media months ago. I mean, there were reports that Trump had stopped a war back then, but now it seems like he led Iran down the primrose path there on the side of Netanyahu and the Israelis. So what is Putin going to believe that Trump wasn't involved in this? No matter how he distances himself, he might want to save some face to preserve, even a remote chance of securing peace. But it's not clear that that was true, that he didn't know about it, that he thought it was disastrous. If he thought that, again, he would withdraw funding. He has that power. He did it before, but I don't think he'll do it again until there's a peace, which I don't think will come anytime soon.
A little spanner in the works of your argument, which is whenever things get a bit hot or red lines get crossed, Putin tends to start rattling his nuclear saber. And everyone knows he's got 6,000 nuclear warheads, and that NATO collectively has more, actually, but America has slightly less than that. But he also understands the principle of MAD, mutually assured destruction. And I've never thought there is a cat in hell's chance of Vladimir Putin launching a nuclear strike at anybody, because the first thing that would happen was that he'd be dead. Within seconds, there would be a retaliatory strike that would kill him. And Vladimir Putin, nothing about his life has been anything other than amassing material goods to enrich himself. Why would a guy like that want to vaporize himself in seconds? So I've never believed any of his threats to use nuclear weapons. And there's certainly no suggestion from credible people that he's thinking of doing so now. So why was it such a mistake for Ukraine to launch such an incredibly audacious attack, which was so successful, which humiliated Putin and made people realize that maybe Ukraine aren't finished after all?
Just again, Piers, this was not so successful. These are the kind of arguments that people in the West...
Well, billions of dollars of planes were blown up by drones that were put on trucks right into the heart of Russia. How could that not be a success?
I don't believe that as many planes as you said
apparently
were
it was
blown
24.
up.
I heard it was 2 dozen. I heard it was 2 dozen reported, I think, in the New York Times, and each one was worth $100 million.
I don't believe that. But even if you're right, it doesn't matter on the overall course of the war. The question is, what effect is this going to have on the battlefield?
Right.
And the answer is, it's not going to have any effect on the battlefield.
Right, this didn't change the balance of power whatsoever. Now, if Ukraine takes back much of that Donbass territory, I will eat my words. I'll say, hey, there is a renewed offensive in this war from Ukraine's perspective, taking back territory that was lost. But we've basically seen the same status quo territorial changes since the beginning of the war. Yeah, there's been ebbs and flows. There's been palpitations, offenses from Ukraine taking back some of that territory, but then it's been pushed back. It's really been pretty minimal in terms of territorial changes since the beginning of this war. This recent attack doesn't change that and didn't change that. Mearsheimer is 100% right here.
It's just a public relations stunt. That's what it is. But there's one side effect, and that is that they hit the strategic nuclear forces of Russia. Now, you say this doesn't matter at all because Putin would never use nuclear weapons.
Right.
You can't know that. You can't know what will happen
in
a future crisis.
Why would he?
And given this, why would what?
Why would he use nuclear weapons, given that he would immediately get vaporized?
Because he would not immediately get vaporized. He could use nuclear weapons in Ukraine and we would not retaliate.
What, you
and
think
Ukraine
Russia could use it? Hang on. You think Russia could use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine and America would just stand by and let that happen? That NATO would stand by and let that happen? They would allow a Russian dictator to use nuclear weapons on a European sovereign country?
I certainly believe that. We are not going to use nuclear weapons if Russia uses nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
Yeah, I totally agree with Mearsheimer. I think it's nutty that Piers Morgan is so convinced of this. What makes you think the U.S. is going to sacrifice its country on behalf of Ukraine? It's only in Ukraine to produce a steady flow of money to the military-industrial complex and set up hegemony, to set up empire building in Eastern Europe. It's not there to provide security to Ukraine or to defend democracy or all these, fairy tales that were sold to the West and sold through corporate media to support this nonsense. If Putin might use nukes if he feels he's backed into a corner, do I want that to happen? No. Do I believe in mutually assured destruction? Yeah. I think that's kind of played out. It certainly did during the Cold War when both Gorbachev and Reagan did similar simulations, and both of them did not use nuclear weapons under a retaliatory strike in that simulation. So, yeah, I think I'm totally with Mearsheimer here. I'm really kind of I'm really kind of awestruck by how convinced Piers Morgan is of this.
Of course we are.
I don't know anybody who argues, because yes, we'd get incinerated. The logic that
So
you
would
laid out
they.
a
That's
minute
the whole
ago would
principle.
apply to us.
Yeah, but the whole point of MAD.
No, they wouldn't.
Well, the whole point.
That's not the point of MAD. The point of MAD is if Ukraine had nuclear weapons, then they would retaliate and the U.S. would be left out of it. The U.S. would not be incinerated just if Russia used nukes on Ukraine. This is crazy. I'm really kind of... I know Piers Morgan's had some wacky ideas in the past, but this one actually kind of floors me.
The MAD is that both sides understand if somebody pressed that button, everyone gets incinerated. That's the point of it, mutually assured destruction.
Not necessarily a proxy that you're using as a pawn on the chessboard of empire building. That doesn't apply. It would apply if Russia nuked the U.S. Yes, I do think that the U.S. would nuke Russia. Targeted. It wouldn't necessarily kill Putin right away. Who knows where Putin is? He probably has as many bunkers as the U.S. president does and as much security as the U.S. president does.
That's why no one uses them.
No, that's not the way. No, that's not the way it works when it comes to Ukraine. Ukraine has no nuclear weapons of its own.
Right.
The Russians can use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. They cannot retaliate. And we would not initiate nuclear use against Russia in response because we would end up getting incinerated in your
Exactly.
story. We would be deterred
But so
by
would they.
MAD.
But so would they.
No. They would use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, knowing full well that it would be extremely unlikely that we would retaliate with nuclear weapons of our own.
I would think it would be 100%, 100% likely. Otherwise, Russia can fire nuclear weapons at anybody. And no one's going to stand for that. Why would they?
No, it cannot fire nuclear weapons at anybody. Firing nuclear weapons at the United States is fundamentally different than firing nuclear weapons at Ukraine.
Why?
Because the U.S. has nuclear weapons. It has the second biggest arsenal. That's why it's fundamentally different. And the U.S. is not going to hang its entire existence in the balance, the U.S. government, over Ukraine. It's just not. That's not why they're in Ukraine. That's the propaganda that the U.S. believes Ukraine is such a tight ally. It's not. It's to empire build in the East, rattle sabers with Russia, try to contain Russia, which is an absurd prospect because Russia isn't actually really expanding except Crimea and then now part of the Donbass because they wouldn't implement Minsk and NATO wouldn't sign the draft treaty that said we're not putting Ukraine in NATO after all this drumbeat of we're putting Ukraine in NATO by Clinton and Bush at the Bucharest summit. So yeah, Mearsheimer is so on point here. This is wild, man. This is wild.
It's a very different situation.
Why is it?
Because the United States has nuclear weapons and Ukraine does not. And if you hit the United States with Russian nuclear weapons, the United States will retaliate against Russia, and you'll be in a general nuclear war. If the Russians use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, Ukraine cannot retaliate, and we're not going to start a nuclear war on their behalf. It's
100%.
a fundamentally different situation. The other point I'd make to you is you do not want to underestimate the risk that great powers are willing to take when they're backed into a corner. Your belief is the Russians would never use nuclear weapons. Why would they do that? Well, the fact is, when great powers are backed into a corner, they sometimes pursue remarkably risky strategies. And one could hypothesize a situation where the Russians use nuclear weapons in a very limited fashion against NATO, understanding full well that there might be some retaliation, or there's likely to be some retaliation, but understanding that in that circumstance, because they're desperate, it makes sense to try to get both sides out on the slippery slope.
100%. I think he's right about this. There's not enough actual examples of this happening in terms of nukes, of course, because only the United States has ever used nukes. Happened twice in 1945 against Japan on, what was it, August 5th and 8th, respectively, or 6th and 9th. But it is true that with backed into a corner, regimes are likely to pull out all the stops to preserve themselves or at least retaliate. I think, frankly, that's the reason why there hasn't been regime change in North Korea, or really serious discussions of attempts for regime change in North Korea, because it acquired nukes. Whereas Gaddafi gave up his nukes, and you saw what happened to him. We all saw that. It was disgusting, and he got couped by a U.S.-led NATO force. So it behooves powers to acquire nukes, but if you don't have nukes, you don't have the same kind of leverage.
To use limited numbers of nuclear weapons to send a message to the West that they're playing with fire. That could happen. Is it likely? No. But I certainly would not say there's never any chance that the Russians, or Putin in particular, would use nuclear weapons.
I think he'd
I don't want to find out. I don't want to risk it. don't want to increase the risk, but in any respect. Why would you want to even do that in the first place? I think the U.S. has already done that. The doomsday clock is as close to midnight as I believe it's ever been. Those who kind of calculate how close we are to nuclear war. I don't want to risk it, but who knows? We don't want to test that. That's the one thing in the world regarding foreign policy you don't want to test. I think this guy won't use nukes. He might not. I hope not. I don't think he wants to at all. Do I think he would if hit by nukes? Yeah, I really do think he would.
He'd like people to think that he would, but I don't think he would in a million light years.
Well, I don't think I know many people who agree with you. Almost everybody I know, hawks and doves in the strategic nuclear community, believe that there is some reasonable possibility, if Putin was backed into a corner, that he would use nuclear weapons. Your argument there's zero chance that he'd use them is not an argument that most people I know would make.
Well, the difference between your argument and mine is I do not believe that Europe and the United States would simply stand back and watch Russia nuke a sovereign democratic country in Europe and do nothing about it. I just refuse to believe that. What would be the point of having any nuclear deterrent if you just allow a Russian dictator to nuke a European country?
Well, the fact is that nuclear weapons are of virtually no utility in this particular case, right? Because the United States, as much as it cares about Ukraine's survival, is not going to risk its own survival. That's what you're talking about. If the United States initiates nuclear use against Russia, it is risking its own survival. And the United States is not going to risk its own survival for Ukraine's survival.
Agreed with that. I don't think the U.S. government actually values Ukraine to the extent Mearsheimer believes, though. We're using Ukraine as a tool. It's like a tool in the toolbox of empire building. It just happens to be on the border of Russia, where the U.S. wants to antagonize Russia. They want to empire build. They want to get money siphoned through the military-industrial complex. But otherwise, I agree with him.
No, but I think that the United States and European leaders, if they haven't already, should make it crystal clear to Vladimir Putin that if he ever tried to use one, he would risk his own survival instantaneously.
I think they can make that argument if they want, but they have no formula for showing how they can take Putin down if he uses nuclear weapons in Ukraine. There's just no way to do it. You can talk like that, but you actually have to tell me how you think it can be done, how Putin can be taken down. And if you're telling me he can be taken down because we can nuke Moscow and kill him in the process, I'm telling you that's an incredible strategy, in large part because we would get incinerated in the process, and we do not want to get incinerated, and therefore we will not use nuclear weapons to defend Ukraine. And you might say, well, we'll use conventional forces. We've been using conventional forces in that conflict to help the Ukrainians since 2022, and the end result is the Ukrainians are losing the war. We can't do anything at the conventional level either to help the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are basically screwed. And
They are, and they're not a NATO power. They are kind of a de facto NATO power. They're certainly receiving more aid than any other NATO country right now. But the U.S. isn't going to dedicate boots on the ground. Neither are the European powers, because they know that or a no-fly zone or any of this other lunacy would draw Russia into a hot war with them because of the way that the NATO treaty is structured. In Article 5, it says that if a power attacks forces from a NATO power, all the other powers must assist them, or at least it implies that they're bound to assist them by the terms of the treaty. That won't happen, and because that won't happen, it doesn't seem like the balance of power in this war is going to shift at all.
It's about time people recognized that fact and came to the understanding that the best thing that could be done for the Ukrainians is to cut a deal now to prevent Ukraine from losing more territory and to prevent more Ukrainians from dying.
Imagine if they did that at Istanbul. They would have lost less territory and less Ukrainians would have died, and less people would be dragged out of their beds for conscription mandates, and less churches would have been shut down by Zelensky, less conscripts on the Russian side would have to fight, less media would be suppressed, oppositional media of Zelensky. Zelensky would actually have to face an election. Imagine that, an election during wartime. That can't happen, right? It only happened in the U.S. during this freaking Civil War and World War II, but yeah, they say it can't happen. So Mearsheimer's right.
So you just let the old Russian dictator take what he wants and move on.
We have no choice. Do you think the Germans in 1945, when Hitler was sitting in the Führer bunker, had any choice but to accept the fact that they were going to lose
that's
to
not
the
the
Red
analogy
Army?
I'd use.
They were going to lose to the Soviet Union?
Well, the analogy I would use would be
Pardon?
to go back to 1939 and say we had a lot of choices then as to whether to surrender to the Nazis or not, and we chose not to.
This is not 1939. You have a war taking place that's been going on since February of 2022. And we're not going to get directly involved in the fighting. And given that we're not going to get directly involved in the fighting, and given that we do not have the material resources to give the Ukrainians to help them turn the tide on the battlefield, right, we should recognize where we stand and where the Ukrainians stand. And we should cut a deal.
Yeah, Mearsheimer is totally right about the solutions here. We do need to withdraw. Actually, Trump doesn't need to negotiate with anyone. He doesn't need to even negotiate with Russia. If we really want peace, we just have to disengage, because peace will follow. Zelensky would have no choice at that point. And this entire mentality that you see throughout so much of the corporate media, and Piers Morgan used it there, is, well, you just want to give Putin everything he wants then and run. Well, yeah, that actually should be the U.S. foreign policy default, is that you shouldn't get into these affairs and these proxy wars with major world powers throughout the world, or any world power, or any country for that matter, because you just get sucked into these geopolitical conflicts where you're constantly becoming the enemy of other nations. You're attracting enemies, you're getting all the enemies by default of your allies, and the extent to which that principle, if you say, well, we can't let Putin get away with it, it means that you have to essentially intervene in every conflict where every government and every ruler takes territory from another country, whether it be through annexation, invasions, political scams, anything. But the U.S. doesn't have the money for that. We don't have the money to do what we're doing right now. We're already $37 trillion in debt because of these outrageous military excursions, on top of everything else the U.S. government spends its money on, entitlement programs and welfare and all sorts of things. Foreign aid and regime change operations, you name it. Corporate welfare out the gazoo. The CARES Act was an ultimate example of that. The recent CR, the bill that the Republicans are entertaining right now. We don't have the funding for that. So yeah, I do think a peace should be signed to prevent Putin from getting maybe everything he wants, if he does want more Ukrainian territory, which actually isn't really, striking if your justification is, well, they just derailed what was going on in the peace process, so I'm going to plunge to the southwest and take more. I don't think he's going to take Ukraine proper, but yeah, Mearsheimer was almost totally right on in this video as far as I'm concerned, but I do want to hear from you what you guys think. Do you think the war in Ukraine will end soon? Do you think Ukraine has really lost on the battlefield already? Let me know in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. Please also consider becoming a YouTube member or Patreon patron to support the channel if you like it and you like my videos. I'd really appreciate that. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.